Hello, and welcome to the St. Paul's Newman Center Homily Podcast for the Solemnity of the Holy Trinity. I'm Tom Quinlivan. This week, Father Rob tells us how the doctrine of Trinity should inform our actions in these troubling times. As always, the readings for the weekend can be found at usccb.org. Let's take a moment now in silence to connect ourselves in prayer to God and one another.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but might have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him will not be condemned, but whoever does not believe has already been condemned, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, this is a rather significant weekend here in Laramie at St. Paul's Newman Center. As many of you know, we will begin celebrating weekend masses in a public fashion this weekend. If you're watching this, you've probably made the decision to stay at home, and I want to continue to encourage you to do that if you're praying well or simply don't feel comfortable gathering in public right now. That dispensation from our Sunday obligation continues, so you should feel no pressure to gather until you are absolutely ready to do that. When you are ready to gather, we are going to need to reserve our spot for those weekend liturgies. You can simply go to the Newman Center website, newmancenter.org, and you'll find a button right there at the top that says Sign Up for Weekend Masses. The seating is done by family size, so please look for the family group that's appropriate for you and click Sign Up. Then you'll click a button at the bottom of the page, and it'll ask you to put in the number of exactly how many people will be coming with you. Then when you arrive here, again, we're asking everyone to enter through the main front door, to keep 6 feet of distance between households as you do so. A minister of hospitality will meet you and will take you to your assigned seat. Assigned seating, you're saying? That's not like coming to church. Well, frankly, I take this as the time for pastor's revenge, because I'll be making those assignments. No, I'm just kidding. If you're on my bad side, there's none of that. It's just a chance for us to gather together in an orderly fashion, to celebrate the Lord and to keep one another safe. I also would like to remind you about living and giving in Christ, the annual diocesan appeal. That still is an obligation and a responsibility we have to financially support the work of our diocese. As you may have read in the materials, and I've mentioned earlier, at least 5% of that money this year will be given to COVID relief to help people who are experiencing unemployment, medical bills, and all the variety of the ways that we have been affected by this illness. So please, if you haven't had a chance to make that pledge yet, consider doing so. You can do that again from our parish webpage or from the materials that you received in your own home. This weekend, celebrating that solemnity of Trinity. I've said to you many times, it's an odd celebration. It's not an event in the life of Christ or the history of the church, but it's a doctrine. And why is it so important? We've also asked the question, if the church stopped teaching the Trinity tomorrow, would our lives change that much? I hope so. I hope, knowing that our God is a God of Trinity, changes the way we interact and the way we live in this world. This Trinity God that is not just one person off in a distance, but a God who in God's self is communion, community. 3 persons living in one God. And I know that sounds crazy. Let me try to explain to a 3-year-old. 3 persons, one God, it's the same in nature, but distinct. Good luck with that one. They're going to look at you with that furrowed brow, probably as confused as you and I are right now. The truth is, we're going to spend our entire lifetime trying to understand this mystery. But my deep prayer is that at some point, we move beyond trying to understand Trinity, and we get more excited about experiencing it, about experiencing a God of communion and love. People throughout history have tried to explain it to us. You remember St. Patrick and that 3-leafed shamrock, the use of an egg, the outer shell, the white, the yolk, all different kinds of images. But I think there's probably no better image than what we just heard in the gospel proclamation. For God so loved the world that God wanted to come be with us. And that's a paraphrase. For God so loved the world that God gave his only Son to bring us life, to bring us salvation. God wanting to come and to dwell among us. If that's not an invitation to move beyond knowing about God, to wanting to know God and to have a relationship with God, I don't know what could be. It's in that relationship where we're able to experience the Trinitarian gifts of love and hope and peace. See, when we start to experience those gifts, we've entered into salvation. We become saved from the anxieties of this world. We become saved from fear and trouble and invited to live in the place of deep peace. And again, as believers, we're not naive. That deep peace doesn't mean that suddenly everything in the world becomes perfect, that suddenly all problems disappear, but it does mean that we don't have to be consumed by them. It does mean that there's a deeper grounding of our being than whatever might be happening at any given moment, that we're grounded in the love of God, invited into the relationship with a God who is no more and no less than perfect love. But one of the secrets is that relationship cannot be lived in isolation. Some of us know that in this present moment more painfully than ever. How many of you are feeling disconnected from your family and friends? How many of you have that deep longing to hug one of your children or grandchildren, to do more than simply talk on the phone or FaceTime, or God forbid, participate in another Zoom meeting? You know that longing to be connected. Do you believe that God might just possibly feel that way about you? That God might have that same deep desire to be with you, to hold you, to talk to you, to wrap God's arms around you? That's the reason that God came to dwell among us. This is why God promises to be with us every time we gather to celebrate the Eucharist, to wrap God's arms of love around us once again and to enter into our very bodies. The doctrine of Trinity is an attempt to describe the love of God that holds everything together. There is no place where God is not. That's Trinity. Our world needs this doctrine more than ever. For most of us, this past week or so has felt like a whirlwind. Maybe you began by hearing about the death of George Floyd. That news, many of our hearts were troubled. Is it happening again? Isn't this going to come to an end? But probably most of us had no idea in this first couple days what was going to come next. For some of us, this has been a scary time. Watching the news, seeing stories of peaceful protest and looting and riot, seeing the use of tear gas, rubber bullets. What kind of a world do we live in? In the midst of all this, trying to discern what the truth is and how I'm supposed to feel or respond with all the media spin. Is the looting part of the protest? Is it a separate group? Is it Antifa or the white supremacists? What's going on? The truth be told, it's hard to make sense of it all right now. But at least for me, the longer this goes on, the fewer words I find myself having to speak about it. The more I'm learning to realize that my life, my existence has been so different from so many. And the only thing I can do is listen and try to learn, try to understand the plight of my brothers and sisters. It came really strong to me this week when I was listening to an NPR interview. There was a 67-year-old black man who is expressing his own frustration, not in an angry, not in a hostile way, but in words of desperation, when he said, things haven't changed and they're never going to change. You know what my first response was? It was to critique him. My first response was to say, oh, come on. Let's look at the things that have happened in the last years in our country. Let's look at what's happened over these years. And then as I listened more, as the reporter interviewed him, I thought, what's going on in my mind? That I simply can't listen to this man. That I either dismiss him because I judge him to be ignorant, to not understand the world as the way I understand it, or to be disingenuous with his comments. Certainly he doesn't feel like nothing's going to change. Or maybe he does. What does that mean? What's that like? Our God is a God of hope, and a God of new life. In the midst of this deep listening, I know that I'm also called to love because I believe in Trinity. While trying to understand the pain of those who experience oppression, I must also try to understand the one who believes that racism doesn't exist. As I listen to each person's voice and try to understand their life, I'm drawn back to that piece of wisdom. When we encounter a struggle or somebody in pain, the question that we shouldn't ask is, what's wrong with you? It's what happened to you. Tell me about your life. Tell me about your experience so that I might understand even better. And then after that deep listening, to bring it to prayer and to say, what is God calling me to do in the midst of this? I've wondered, is God inviting me in social media to make another post, to make a strong statement? Is God inviting me to participate in those peaceful protests in Laramie, Wyoming? To be honest, I found it an excuse to say, well, they happened at 5 o'clock. That's the same time daily mass. It's been a nice absolution from having to make a concrete decision on what to do. The one thing I do know that God is inviting me to do is to remind us all of human dignity, to remind us of the truth of Trinity, that we are all connected. There's no denying that. There's no way we can get around it. We can ignore it to our own peril and the peril of others, or we can try to embrace that complex reality. We can try to embrace the truth that every person's life is different and that most of my brothers and sisters have had very different experiences than I have. And for me to try to judge their life or actions based upon my experience is a great mistake. For the measuring stick, it seems that God invites us to measure with, is that of love. God so loved the world that he sent his only Son to be with us. How are we to respond? How are we invited to be people of Trinity? Maybe this week we want to engage in some deep listening, some deep praying, and to say, well, I know that God so loved the world. How about me? And if I do, where am I willing to go to show that love?
Thank you for joining us in prayer again this week. A reminder that you can sign up for liturgies by visiting our website, newmancenter.org, or by calling the office at 745-5461. Until next week, peace, God bless, and be well.